The Intergalactic Peacekeeper Academy was a place of both awe and dread. Built within the hollowed core of a dead moon, its vast, sterile halls were lined with silver walls that seemed to hum with the weight of the countless cadets who had walked through them. It was a place where the finest warriors, diplomats, and peacekeepers from over 47 species came to forge their future, where the stakes were always high, and the competition was even higher. In the shadows of this prestigious academy, however, was a secret. A trial attest, whispered about in the back halls and dim-lit corridors, the Vorik Cub evaluation. James H. Halstead stood at the edge of one of the Academy's gleaming observation windows, staring out at the barren moon's surface. The weight of his decision was heavy on his chest. His uniform was impeccably tailored, as it always was, but inside there was a storm. He had never been the strongest cadet, nor was he the fastest, the most skilled, or the one to draw attention in drills. His scores were solid, but nothing remarkable. In a place where every cadet was expected to be a champion, James often felt like an afterthought. And yet it was precisely this unremarkableness that had caught the Academy's attention. James was different. He had an uncanny ability to stay calm, to hold his ground when everything around him spun into chaos. His ability to adapt, to bend but never break, was something the Academy couldn't ignore. There was something about his demeanor, something they couldn't measure, that set him apart. A soft beep sounded on his comm unit, breaking his reverie. It was Skit, his friend and fellow cadet, a member of the alien species known as the Xi. Skit was a small, reptilian creature with skin the color of a twilight sky and 6 eyes that blinked independently of each other. They had become unlikely friends after their first few days at the Academy, and while Skit was as cautious and strategic as any Xi, James's carefree approach to danger had made them a curious pair. "James, you're thinking about it again, aren't you?" Skit's voice was low, soft, laced with concern. James could hear the familiar hesitation in his tone. He knew what Skit meant. "The Vorik Cub test," James muttered. He could almost feel the weight of the words. No one dared speak it aloud unless they had to. It was an unspoken nightmare, a rite of passage that broke more cadets than it ever helped. "You don't have to do it. We've already talked about this," Skit added, his voice crackling with the strange, soothing tone of his species. "You've earned your rotation already. You've got a spot on the fleet. No need to risk it." James turned slowly to face the small screen on his comm. Skit's image flickered in and out, his many eyes watching him with that ever-present concern. "I didn't volunteer for this, Skit," James said with a small grin. "They changed the protocol last week. I don't have a choice anymore." Skit let out a soft hiss, a noise that was both exasperated and worried. "Because of the Cubs, right? Those things, they're not normal." The memory of the rumors hit James like a wave. The Vorik Cubs weren't even large, not in the traditional sense. The size of a Terran beagle, they were swift and unpredictable, with claws that could tear through the strongest of materials and teeth sharp enough to break bones. They were notorious for being a part of the psychological resilience test, but no one knew exactly how they were used. Their behavior was erratic, testing every cadet's ability to handle fear, panic, and aggression. Some cadets had fled the chamber, their armor torn, the scent of fear lingering in the air. Others had been dragged out by medics, shaking and unrecognizable, their spirits broken. The most terrifying part? There were no reports on how to prepare for the test. It wasn't listed on the syllabus. There were no study guides, only a black door marked Psychological Resilience Test 7, and 2 armed guards standing silently outside it. James's fingers tightened around the strap of his bag, his heart racing slightly despite himself. "I've faced worse before," he said, though even to himself, his voice sounded too rehearsed. "Maybe, but this isn't a dog or a rifle range. You have no idea what you're walking into," Skit warned, his 6 eyes narrowing. "You're a good cadet, James, but don't be reckless, please. This could break you." James let out a soft sigh and pushed away from the window, his boots making a soft sound on the polished floor as he moved toward the training hall. His mind was spinning, but he knew this was something he had to face. He had no idea what was on the other side of that black door, but he had made a choice. "Thanks for looking out for me, Skit," he said quietly. "I've got to do this, for me, for all of us. Besides, someone has to show them that humans don't break that easily." With a flick of his wrist, he ended the comm call, his thoughts clouding as he walked deeper into the academy. He could feel the eyes of other cadets on him, their gazes following him as he passed by. Whispers followed in his wake. Most of them knew who he was, the quiet human who somehow made it through every test without breaking a sweat. He wasn't a prodigy, and he wasn't a fighter, but there was something about him that caught attention. Maybe it was the calm in his eyes, or the way he could face the worst chaos without even flinching. But as he passed the training halls and saw cadets hard at work, sweat pouring down their faces as they trained for simulated combat scenarios, James knew that this test would be unlike anything he had ever faced. The black door loomed in front of him, heavy and foreboding. Two guards stood on either side, their hands resting on their weapons, staring ahead, unblinking. There was no going back now. He approached the door slowly, feeling his heart race despite his attempts to steady it. The tension in his body was palpable, but he reminded himself he was calm. He had to be calm. The door opened with a hiss, and James stepped inside. The room was dim, its concrete walls lined with strange, jagged boulders and faux debris meant to simulate an alien cave. The air smelled faintly of metal and something else, something almost primal. His eyes scanned the room for the cubs. He saw nothing, but he could feel them just beyond his sight. Then the first cub appeared, a dark shape in the shadows, its glowing eyes locking onto his. It was small, but its movements were fast and calculated. Another appeared beside it, then another. 5 in total, each one seeming to grow more menacing as they approached. James sat down slowly, crossing his legs, keeping his gaze neutral. He made no sudden moves, no threats. He only observed. One of the cubs growled softly, its fur bristling as it inched closer. James didn't flinch. "Hey, little guys," he said softly, his voice steady. "You're a lot cuter than the rumors said." The cubs halted, their eyes narrowing. James's heart rate was stable. His body was calm. But inside there was something else, an ancient primal tension, a warning echoing in the back of his mind. But he didn't move. He simply waited like a person waiting for a bus, indifferent. The cubs approached, circling him, their behavior erratic as if trying to find a weakness. One nipped at his boot. Another brushed its head against his knee. Then the largest cub stepped forward, its snout close to his face. It sniffed. And then it did something no one expected. It nudged him gently, before flopping down at his feet with a deep, rumbling sigh. The room fell silent. James, still unmoving, looked down at the cub. He could feel its body settle into a calm, relaxed state. His breath was steady, his heart rate still perfectly normal. He reached down slowly, scratching behind its ear, the fur soft under his fingers. In the observation room, the instructors were staring at the monitors, their faces pale. "Run the scan again," one of them muttered. "No signs of stress," the medtech reported. James just sat there, surrounded by the cubs, as they gradually grew calm around him, a sense of confusion hanging in the air. The test was far from over, but already something had changed. "What the hell is he doing?" Instructor Rowe muttered under her breath. James remained still, wondering if he was breaking the system, or if the system had simply underestimated him all along. The door to the test chamber slammed shut behind James with a resounding thud that seemed to echo through the stillness. The air in the room felt thick, the tension palpable. As soon as the door locked, the lights above flickered, dimming as the artificial cave environment activated. Shadows stretched across the room, making everything feel colder, darker. James could hear the faint hum of machinery working to create an atmosphere of instability, just like the real conditions they would face on a battlefield. The cubs circled him warily, their bright eyes glowing in the dim light, reflecting the harsh reality of their training. James sat cross-legged on the cold floor, his breathing steady and slow, as though he were waiting for a bus on a quiet street, completely unfazed by the growing tension in the air. He had been trained to deal with chaos, to stay calm no matter the circumstances, and this was just another test. His eyes tracked the cubs as they moved, their bodies sleek and dangerous. They were small, but their movements were so fast and erratic that they looked like living razor blades. Their growls reverberated in the air, a low, menacing sound, and one cub bared its teeth as it prowled forward, testing the human in its midst. The instinct to fight was in the air, but James ignored it. Instead, he simply observed, his gaze calm but never leaving the cubs. The first cub lunged forward, its claws extended in a flash of motion. It moved with terrifying speed, and for a brief moment James felt his pulse quicken. But just as quickly he remained still, his body unyielding. The cub skidded to a stop, its sharp claws leaving scratches on the concrete floor. It stopped, its nostrils flaring as it assessed him. James didn't flinch, he didn't move. The cub tilted its head slightly, confused by the lack of reaction. It sniffed the air, its gaze flickering over James's body. Another cub circled behind him, its movements quick and jerky, like a predator trying to find an opening. But James remained unmoved. One of the instructors in the observation room tapped a sensor, monitoring his vital signs. Pulse rate steady, no spike in adrenaline. Another technician checked the brainwave patterns on a screen. His brain activity is consistent. No signs of fear, no stress response. "What is he doing?" Instructor Rowe muttered. "The cubs are supposed to provoke an emotional response, force the cadet to react. This isn't normal." James could hear the soft murmurs through the intercom, but he kept his focus on the cubs, watching their movements carefully. They didn't understand him. They were predators trained to test the limits of their prey, but they were also testing him. It was all about control. Who would break first, the human or the cubs? As the cubs circled him again, James allowed himself to relax, lowering his shoulders and letting his body feel the weight of the environment. It was just like the times when his younger brother and their chaotic pack of dogs would come charging into the house, loud, unpredictable, and desperate for attention. He had learned early to remain calm amidst the noise, to let the chaos wash over him without being swept away by it. The cubs were no different. The cubs began to move more cautiously, sensing his lack of fear. The largest one, a sleek white creature with gleaming eyes, stepped forward again, sniffing the air with precision. This one was different. It wasn't just testing him, it was measuring him as though it could see into his soul. James didn't flinch. His calmness was his strength, and he wasn't going to let this creature rattle him. The cub's growl was low, almost a whisper, but it sent a shiver down James's spine. It leaned closer, its hot breath brushing his face. James held its gaze for a moment, unblinking. Then, just as he was about to look away, he saw something unexpected in the cub's eyes. Curiosity, not aggression. The cub was trying to figure him out, testing not just his body, but his mind, too. James took a breath and then spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Hey, little guy," he said, his hand inching toward the cub's head. "You're a lot cuter than the rumors said." For a moment, the room was deathly quiet. The cub's growl faltered, replaced by a confused rumble. James's calmness seemed to have a strange effect on it. The cub sniffed him again, this time more slowly, cautiously, as if considering the possibility that this human might not be a threat. Then, in a surprising move, the cub pressed its head against James's knee and flopped down with a soft sigh, rolling onto its back. A ripple of disbelief passed through the observation room. No one spoke for several seconds. "What the hell just happened?" Instructor Rowe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The other instructors were staring at their monitors, unable to process what they were witnessing. No one had ever seen this before. The cub, the very creature that had broken so many cadets, was now lying down peacefully beside James, not out of submission but out of something else. "Initiate secondary scans," Rowe ordered, though her voice held an edge of uncertainty. "Check for pheromone anomalies. We need to understand this." James looked down at the cub, still lying peacefully in his lap. Its tiny chest rose and fell with rhythmic breaths. Another cub approached and gently nipped at his boot. James didn't react. Instead, he slowly extended his hand, letting the cub sniff his fingers. The cub hesitated, but after a moment it nuzzled his hand, purring softly. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The tension, the fear, the expectations, they all melted away. It was just James and the cubs in a strange moment of calm amidst the chaos. The other cubs began to gather around him, their movements less aggressive now, their posturing more playful than predatory. One of them climbed onto his shoulder, curling up to sleep. Another made its way to his lap, curling up beside the first cub. The silence in the observation room was deafening. "What is he doing?" Instructor Rowe repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "How is this possible?" James sat there, surrounded by the 5 cubs who were now contentedly napping in his lap. His breathing was steady, his pulse stable. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a warrior. But in this moment he was something more, something the Academy hadn't anticipated. He was calm, he was unbroken. And somehow, that was enough to change everything. The chamber was eerily still, the only sound the gentle breathing of the cubs nestled in James's lap. The sharp growl from the shadows echoed through the room, vibrating the walls and reverberating in the quiet hum of the Academy systems. The largest cub, the one who had been the most aggressive, the one who had seemed ready to tear him apart, stepped forward again. Its body was taut with tension, its nostrils flaring, and its glowing eyes locked onto James with a piercing intensity that made even the other cubs shift uneasily. James didn't move. He stayed perfectly still even as the growl vibrated through his chest. His pulse was steady, his breathing slow and even. He wasn't afraid. He had learned long ago that fear was something you could control if you simply acknowledged it and let it pass. The trick was not letting fear control you. The cub's massive form was now directly in front of him. Its fangs were bared, but the ferocity that had defined the cub's previous behavior was not as sharp now. There was hesitation. There was confusion. James didn't look directly into the cub's eyes. Instead, he allowed his gaze to shift briefly to the side, breaking eye contact in a gesture that suggested neutrality. He had no intention of being submissive. He simply wanted to show the cub that he wasn't a threat. The cub snorted and lowered its head slightly, its sharp gaze still intense but no longer focused entirely on aggression. The other cubs had stopped their movements, as though watching the interaction, waiting for some sort of signal. For a moment, James felt an odd connection with the creature. Not that it was a tame pet or a docile animal, but that it was struggling, just like he had, to make sense of what was happening. Its natural instincts were telling it one thing, attack, but its response to his calmness was telling it another. Something in James's steady energy was making the cub question its assumptions. Without thinking, James let his hand drift slowly to the side, reaching out towards the cub. He didn't try to force the interaction. He simply offered his presence, palm open and unthreatening. The cub took a step forward, its muscles rippling beneath its sleek fur. It sniffed his hand once, then twice. The air in the room grew heavier with the tension, but James maintained his calm even as the cub leaned closer. Slowly, the cub nudged his hand with its cold, wet nose. James allowed a slight smile to touch his lips. "There you go," he whispered softly. "It's not so bad, is it?" A soft murmur from behind the glass caught his attention. Skit, his Xi friend, had been watching from the observation deck the entire time. James could tell from the set of his eyes and the soft twitch of his six-lidded gaze that he was both confused and in awe. Skit had never seen anything like this before. "I don't believe this," Skit murmured under his breath, barely audible through the intercom. He's making it work." The moment felt surreal. The tension in the air that had gripped James's chest for so long, ever since he'd entered the chamber, began to ease. The cubs, once hostile, were now settling around him in what could almost be mistaken for a peaceful gathering. The first cub had sprawled out in his lap, the second had curled around his legs, and now the largest cub was standing beside him, watching him with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. James was beginning to understand something he hadn't before. These creatures, as vicious as they were, weren't simply predators. They were testing him, not just for strength or courage, but for something deeper. They were testing his mind, his soul, and his ability to remain unbroken in the face of chaos. "Is this really happening?" Skit asked, his voice filled with disbelief. James felt a stirring in his chest, a sense of something new and powerful. He wasn't the strongest, he wasn't the fastest. But there was a different kind of strength here, one that didn't require violence, one that didn't need dominance. It was about understanding, about connection, about patience. The cubs, sensing his steady presence, seemed to relax, no longer seeing him as prey to be conquered, but as an equal in some strange, unspoken way. The instructors, however, were not so easily convinced. Their eyes were still glued to the observation monitors, their every movement tense and calculated. "Run the pheromone analysis again," Instructor Rowe barked. "We need to know if there's any environmental factor affecting his response." But the med techs who scanned James's vitals could only report what they already knew. There were no signs of abnormal hormone levels. His cortisol levels were within the range of a relaxed cadet. His heart rate was barely above baseline, and there was no spike in adrenaline. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't in shock. He was simply calm. "It doesn't make sense," Instructor Rowe muttered. "No cadet has ever." She cut herself off, frustration boiling over. No matter what tests they ran, no matter how many scans, they couldn't explain it. The cubs, the very creatures designed to break cadets with their aggressive tactics, were now napping in James's lap as though they had simply given up. James shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the cubs too much. He didn't want to wake them. They were comfortable now, content, which was something no one in the academy had expected. The cubs were supposed to test him until he snapped, but instead they had surrendered. It was a quiet victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. But not all victories were celebrated in the academy. Not yet. "He's broken the system. Instructor Rowe finally said, her voice colder than before. And that's a problem. James looked up, his mind racing. He had done it. He had somehow passed the test, not with brute force, but with something else, something that the Academy had never accounted for, emotional intelligence. He wasn't just calm. He understood the Cubs in a way that no one else had. He had connected with them on a level that transcended the military methods the Academy favored. He had passed the test in a way that made the system itself seem outdated. But just as he thought he could relax, the soft voice of the lead instructor crackled through the intercom, breaking the moment's peace. "Cadet Halstead," the voice was cold and clinical, "this test is not finished." James's stomach dropped as he slowly looked at the largest cub, still nestled beside him, its deep growl slowly returning. The atmosphere in the room had shifted again. He knew that things were far from over, and now more than ever he could feel the weight of what he had just set in motion. The growl from the largest cub vibrated through the chamber, snapping James out of his meditative state. The peaceful, calm moment he had shared with the cubs evaporated in an instant. The air in the room shifted once more, heavy with tension. The cub's eyes gleamed like molten silver, its posture alert and predatory once again. Its body was taut, muscles rippling under its fur as it stepped closer to James. The soft purring from earlier was now replaced with a low, rumbling growl. James's heart rate didn't spike. His breath didn't falter. He had trained for moments like this, but something in the atmosphere had changed. The Academy's influence, the pressure from the observing instructors, it all began to weigh down on him. There was more to this test than simply facing the Cubs. There was something political at play, something bigger than the Cubs themselves. In the observation room, Instructor Rowe's eyes were narrowed, her antenna twitching in irritation. Her lips curled into a thin line as she barked orders. "Increase the pressure, initiate the stress simulations. The cadet needs to break. We can't let him redefine the test." James, still sitting cross-legged, didn't move. The cub circled him, its growl growing louder, but he remained calm. He was doing exactly what they didn't want him to do. He was passing the test without breaking. Behind the glass, Rowe's frustration was becoming palpable. The stress simulations, the loud noises, flashing lights, and environmental changes designed to push cadets to their limits, flickered to life. The lights in the chamber dimmed further, flickering erratically as if malfunctioning. The ground began to rumble beneath him, a low vibration signaling an earthquake simulation. Dust began to settle from the ceiling, and the temperature dropped abruptly, making James's breath fog in the cold air. It was working. The cubs, disturbed by the sudden change, began to hiss and growl, their movements becoming more erratic. One cub lashed out, swiping at his boot. Another clung to his leg, biting down on his uniform. The largest cub, sensing the change in its environment, took a step back, growling, its teeth bared. For a brief moment, James felt a flicker of doubt, a twinge of unease that he quickly pushed away. "This is what they want," he reminded himself. "They want me to break." But he wouldn't, not this time. The temperature in the chamber continued to plummet, and the rumble from the ground intensified. James's clothing was suddenly heavy with the weight of the stress simulations. His vision blurred from the flashing lights. Yet, through it all, he remained rooted, his breathing steady. He wasn't going to let the Academy's games break him. Instructor Rowe's voice crackled over the intercom, a sharp, demanding tone in her words. "Cadet Halstead, you will respond. Show us your weakness. Fight back, scream something. This test was never meant to be passed." James's fingers twitched at the command. He could feel the other cadets watching, their eyes trained on him through the observation glass. Their expectations were clear. They wanted him to break, to fail, to give them something they could understand, something predictable. But he wasn't predictable. He was human. He looked at the cubs, his gaze softening despite the tension in the room. The largest cub was still growling, but its stance was no longer aggressive. It was confused, cautious. James stood slowly, his body moving with careful precision. The ground continued to rumble beneath him, and the flashing lights turned the room into a disorienting mess of colors. But he didn't falter. He approached the largest cub slowly, as if it were a stray dog rather than a predator. "I'm not your enemy," he whispered, his voice steady and calm. He reached out not in aggression, but with the same quiet strength that had carried him through the Academy so far. The cub's growl softened, its posture shifting, no longer a sign of aggression, but something else, a hesitance, a curiosity. The tension in the room seemed to ease just slightly. The instructors, however, were not impressed. They had expected James to fight back, to scream in fear or rage. They had expected the stress simulations to push him into submission, to force him to react as they had designed. But James didn't react. He didn't even flinch. He simply continued to be calm, to exist in the chaos without being swept away by it. "This can't be happening," Ro muttered under her breath. "He's not supposed to be able to do this. He's breaking the system." As the cubs settled around him, no longer attacking or posturing aggressively, James felt a shift in the atmosphere. The room no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like an observation room, a place of study. The cubs, once hostile, had become something different in his presence. They weren't companions, but they weren't enemies either. The instructors continued to observe, their frustration mounting. The tension that had gripped them from the beginning began to crack, the facade of control slipping. And that's when James realized something else. This test wasn't about him and the cubs. It was about control. The Academy had created a system, a protocol, a method that worked for every species except one: humans. The Academy had assumed that humans, with their emotions, would crumble under the pressure. They had believed that the only way to succeed was through dominance, through conquering fear. But James had shown them something different. He hadn't conquered the cubs. He hadn't overpowered them. He had simply existed in harmony with them. And that, it seemed, was the problem. The door to the test chamber hissed shut behind him, sealing off the room from the rest of the Academy. James remained still as the dim lights flickered back on, casting a cold, mechanical glow across the chamber. The cubs were curled around him, their tiny chests rising and falling in peaceful slumbers. Their once dangerous, unpredictable nature had dissipated, replaced by calm and exhaustion. They no longer posed a threat. They had accepted him, and in their own way, he had accepted them. But James knew this moment was fleeting. From the observation room, Instructor Ro's sharp voice echoed through the intercom once again, breaking the silence. "Cadet Halstead, you are no longer in a controlled environment. You've shown us something unexpected. But this was never meant to be a test of empathy. This is the true test." His stomach twisted. The smooth, calculated tone of Ro's voice told him everything he needed to know. The Academy wasn't done with him yet. They had allowed him to pass, yes, but only because they were setting him up for something worse. The ground beneath his feet shifted again, the low hum of machinery growing louder as the environment changed. The soft air of the chamber turned cold, the temperature dropping rapidly, and the rumbling beneath his feet intensified. James stiffened, his senses sharpening. Something was wrong. The test was evolving, he could feel it. The cubs shifted uneasily in their sleep, their growls low and indistinct as they stirred, disturbed by the changing atmosphere. "This test isn't just about fear, Halstead," Ro's voice crackled over the intercom again. "It's about control, and we will test your ability to lead, to handle more than just yourself. You'll be tested as a leader, as a peacekeeper. The cubs will not be your only challenge." James's pulse quickened as he realized what was happening. The chamber around him, the entire test, wasn't designed just to break him physically or emotionally. It was a test of leadership. The Academy had seen something in him that no other cadet had shown, and now they wanted to push him further. They wanted to see if he could handle the responsibility of leading others, even when everything around him fell apart. The lights flickered again, this time blindingly bright, before plunging the room into total darkness. A low hum sounded from the walls, and James's heart thudded in his chest. His breathing slowed, focusing, centering himself as the sound of distant doors sliding open echoed through the chamber. Then chaos erupted. From the corners of the chamber, figures began to emerge, cadets. Humans, aliens, species James had only seen in passing. They were all dressed in different uniforms, each representing a different faction of the Academy. Some were armed. Others wore expressions of fear or determination. The Academy had thrown them in, too, along with the cubs. They were all here to fight, to survive, and to test one another. James stood and glanced at the cubs, who were now fully awake, their bodies tense. The largest one, the same cub that had challenged him earlier, locked eyes with him, its stare unwavering, and James knew what he had to do. The cubs were his responsibility now. They had imprinted on him. They had become part of his challenge. If he wanted to pass this trial, he had to protect them, to lead them, and that meant controlling the chaos. He turned, seeing the cadets forming scattered groups around the room, some slowly approaching, others already in the midst of tense whispers. There were no weapons here, at least not yet, but that didn't mean there wouldn't be. The Academy had designed this test with unpredictability in mind, and it was clear that every cadet was about to be pushed beyond their limits. James took a deep breath, then looked down at the cubs, who were now surrounding him in a loose circle, their eyes scanning the room, alert. They had become his silent partners in this madness. They had shown him trust, and now it was time for him to do the same. "Stay close," he whispered softly, more to the cubs than the cadets. He bent down slightly, his hands grazing the soft fur of the largest cub. "I'll protect you, and I'll protect everyone else, too." With that, he began to move forward, his every step deliberate and careful. He wasn't here to fight. He wasn't here to dominate. He was here to lead. He had to prove that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in brute force or combat prowess, but in their ability to adapt, to understand, and to lead with compassion and clarity. Suddenly, the lights snapped back on, blindingly bright again, and the rumbling noise stopped. A new voice crackled over the intercom, cool and clinical. "Test phase 1 complete. You've passed the individual psychological evaluation. Now the next phase begins. The time for calm is over. You must lead." James blinked, taking a deep breath as his eyes scanned the room. The cadets were closing in. Some were eyeing him warily, their hands resting on weapons, an empty threat for now, but not one he could ignore. Others were moving away, instinctively drawing back. James's heart rate was steady, his breathing slow, but inside his mind raced. What was Rowe planning? What did the Academy want him to prove? A few of the cadets began to move forward, and James instinctively took a step back, his arms out to keep the cubs close. A group of 4 cadets, 2 human, 1 Zovian, and 1 Kalyan, circled, their eyes flashing with anticipation. The Kalyan was the first to speak. "You think you can lead those animals?" he sneered, motioning to the cubs. "You're nothing but a joke." James glanced at the cubs. They weren't just animals. They were his responsibility, his challenge, and they had shown him trust. He wasn't going to let them down. "I'm not here to fight you," James said, his voice even. "I'm here to survive and keep us all alive. If you want to make it out of here, you'll need to work together, all of us. The cubs, the cadets, everyone." The Zovian, a tall, thin alien with a reptilian face, snorted. "You talk like a diplomat, not a warrior. You're going to need more than just words to survive in here." James's eyes narrowed, his jaw setting. He wasn't going to back down, but he also wasn't going to let the situation escalate into violence. The room was shifting into chaos, and he knew this was what the Academy had intended. They wanted him to crack under the pressure, to fight, to lead with force. But James was different. "I didn't come here to win your respect," James said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of conviction. "I came here to survive and make sure we all make it out. If you want to fight, then you can fight each other. But if you want to win this, you'll follow my lead. We all have to trust each other." The Kalyan's expression hardened, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty. Suddenly, the lights dimmed once more, signaling the next phase of the test. The ground began to rumble again, and the cubs growled softly, sensing the next challenge. "We'll see how long that calm lasts," the Kalyan muttered under his breath. James tightened his grip on the cubs. This wasn't just a test of physical endurance. It wasn't about outlasting the environment or the creatures. This was a test of leadership, and if he was going to pass, he had to prove that a true leader could unite those around him, not by force, but by trust. As the cadets began to circle closer, weapons in hand, the true challenge was about to begin. The darkness swallowed the room once again, and James felt the weight of the silence settle around him like a heavy cloak. His breath was steady, but his pulse was quickening. This was it, the moment the Academy had been preparing him for. They had pushed him to the edge, to the breaking point, and now they wanted to see if he could hold his ground. They wanted to see if he could lead. The cubs, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stood with him, their sleek bodies rigid, their sharp eyes glinting in the dim light. James gently ran his fingers over the largest cub's back, grounding himself in the bond they had formed. Despite the pressure mounting around him, his mind was clear. The situation had escalated, but his resolve was stronger than ever. "We need to move," he whispered, his voice low but firm. "Stay close." He could hear the sounds of the other cadets shifting in the darkness, their movements tense, filled with purpose. They were closing in, some making no attempt to conceal their intent. The Kalyan from earlier was moving forward, his heavy footsteps echoing through the chamber. The Zovian had already drawn a small knife, his eyes calculating. The others followed suit, weapons appearing in the darkness like ghostly shadows, their glinting edges reflecting the weak light. James's mind raced as he assessed the situation. The Academy had orchestrated this chaos to test his leadership, to break him, but he wasn't going to fall into their trap. The test wasn't just about the Cubs or his ability to stay calm. It was about his ability to unite everyone in the face of adversity. He had to keep them from falling into violence. He had to prove that trust and compassion could lead the way. "Listen to me," James called, his voice cutting through the growing tension in the air. "We don't have to fight. We're all here for the same reason, to make it out alive. If we turn on each other, we're all dead. The Academy set this up to break us. Don't let them win." The Kalyan stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. "You think we'll listen to you? You're not in charge here, human." James didn't flinch. "I'm not in charge, but I'm trying to save all of us. I'm not asking for your respect. I'm asking you to survive. That's all that matters right now." There was a brief pause, a moment where James could feel the weight of their uncertainty. But then, a voice echoed from the back of the group. Skit, his Xi friend, still watching from the observation deck, had heard him. "He's right, we don't need to fight. The Cubs didn't attack him. He didn't react with fear, but he didn't react with violence either. He just—" "Just what?" the Zovian spat, his blade gleaming in the low light. Skit hesitated. "He just showed us that we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to fight back in a system designed to break us. It's not the enemy we need to defeat, it's the system. You're all thinking about the wrong kind of battle." For a moment the room fell silent, and the tension hung heavy in the air. The cadets shifted, uneasy. They had come to the Academy to be the best, to dominate, and now this human was asking them to rethink everything they had been taught. James felt the eyes of the other cadets upon him, and for the first time since the test had started, he sensed a shift. The hesitation wasn't just in the other cadets, it was in him too. Could he really lead them without resorting to violence? Could he make them see that leadership wasn't about domination? The Academy had trained them all to think like warriors, to believe that strength was in physical prowess, but James was showing them that strength could come from another place entirely. The largest cub, still standing beside him, let out a soft, questioning chirp, as though sensing the change. James reached out to it, his hand steady as it nuzzled against him. "We're all in this together," James said again, his voice strong despite the chaos swirling around them. "We can make it out, but only if we stop fighting each other and start working together." There was a long silence, and then, slowly, the Zovian lowered his knife. The Kalyan didn't move, but his gaze shifted from the Cubs to James, an unreadable expression on his face. "You've got some nerve, Halstead," the Kalyan muttered, though there was less malice in his voice now. "But I guess you're not wrong. We're all trapped here, aren't we?" Skit's voice, calm and unwavering, broke through the silence again. "We're not trapped. We're being tested, and we need to pass it together or none of us will survive." James could see the shift in the other cadets. The tension didn't disappear, but it loosened. They were still wary, still unsure, but they weren't ready to turn on him, not yet. And that, James realized, was his first victory. But the Academy wasn't done with him yet. The lights flickered once more, signaling the start of the next phase of the test. The chamber's environment shifted again, the temperature plummeting further, the lights dimming. The Cubs stirred, their instincts kicking in as the ground beneath them rumbled. James felt his body tense instinctively, but he held his ground, eyes scanning the room for the next challenge. A loud, guttural roar echoed from the far side of the chamber. It wasn't one of the Cubs. James turned his head slowly, narrowing his eyes. A new presence had entered the test, something bigger, much bigger. "What now?" one of the cadets muttered, the fear returning to their voice. James didn't respond. He was already moving, eyes focused, assessing the danger. The room had shifted, yes, but now the test was about to escalate. He had united the cadets for a brief moment, but the true challenge was yet to come. Behind the shadowed walls of the chamber, the unmistakable silhouette of a creature, a predator, far larger than the Cubs, loomed in the darkness. Its eyes glinted with malice, and its heavy steps shook the ground. "Stay close," James said quietly, his hand resting on the largest Cub's back. "We'll get through this, but we need to work together. No one gets left behind." The cadets were still uncertain, still unsure whether to follow him or fight. But one thing was certain. The next phase of the test was about to begin, and there was no going back. The true challenge wasn't just physical. It was everything James had been trying to teach them: trust, cooperation, and leadership in the face of danger. If he couldn't unite them now, they would fail. The massive creature advanced slowly, and James knew that this was the moment of truth. The Academy had thrown everything at him: fear, chaos, even violence, but now it was his turn to face the real test. The creature's massive form emerged from the darkness, its glowing eyes locking onto James with an unnerving intensity. It was unlike anything James had ever seen, towering, with scales that shimmered like polished stone, jagged claws extending from each massive paw. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and predatory, as if it had all the time in the galaxy to hunt. Every step it took shook the ground beneath them, sending tremors through the chamber. The cadets froze, their weapons drawn but uncertain. They had been prepared for the chaos of combat drills, for tests that pushed their physical endurance and strength. But this creature, this thing, was different. It wasn't just a test of skill, it was a test of survival. And James knew that if he didn't act quickly, the test would be over before it even started. "Stay together," James said, his voice steady, cutting through the rising panic. "Don't make any sudden moves." The cadets, still unsure whether to trust him, glanced at each other nervously. Some tightened their grips on their weapons, others hesitated, but James wasn't worried about their hesitation. He was focused on the creature, watching its movements carefully. The cubs had already tensed, their low growls vibrating through the chamber. The largest cub, the one that had been closest to James from the beginning, stepped forward, its fur bristling. It was ready. But this wasn't a fight James could win with force alone. The creature wasn't just another target to be eliminated. It was a challenge on a deeper level, a challenge to his ability to lead, to unite everyone in the face of overwhelming odds. James's mind raced. What would the Academy want from him here? They had set this up as a test of his ability to lead. But what did leadership mean when facing something like this? Strength? Force? No, it had to be something else. This wasn't a fight where dominance would win. He had to show the cadets that they could face this challenge together, not as individuals fighting for glory, but as a unified team. The beast snarled, its breath hot and heavy, the sound of its growls vibrating in the chamber. It was close now, and its eyes never left James. But the cubs, sensing their leader's calm, began to move toward the creature as well, their eyes locked onto the massive predator with an intensity that matched its own. "We don't fight it," James said, more to himself than anyone else. "We outsmart it, we make it retreat, we." Before he could finish, the creature lunged. It moved like a blur, a massive force of nature charging directly toward him. The cubs reacted immediately, leaping to intercept. The largest cub shot forward, crashing into the creature's side with a loud snarl. The force of the impact knocked the creature sideways for a moment, but it quickly regained its footing, its sharp claws scraping the floor as it turned back toward James. The cub had given him a moment, just a moment to act. "Now," James shouted, his voice clear and commanding. He didn't wait for anyone to react. He knew what needed to be done. The cadets had been trained to think like soldiers, to fight, to survive. But now they needed to think like a team. They needed to move as one, not as individuals. The creature wasn't going to give them a second chance. The Kalyan and Zovian cadets, their weapons still drawn, sprang into action. But instead of charging in blindly, they followed James's lead. The Kalyan cadet, normally aggressive and stubborn, hesitated for only a moment before signaling to the others to flank the creature. The Zovian cadet, who had been tense and unsure, moved to cover the cubs, positioning himself between the predator and its potential prey. James's eyes were locked on the creature's every move. He could feel the tension building in the air, a pressure that seemed to push against him. But he remained calm. The cubs were still in motion, distracting the creature, keeping it from focusing entirely on them. They weren't fighting it. They were forcing it to engage with them in a way that kept its attention divided. "Keep it moving," James shouted to the cadets. "Don't let it corner us." The creature's eyes narrowed, and for the first time it seemed to realize that this wasn't going according to its plan. It growled louder, its body low to the ground, preparing to pounce. But the cadets were ready. The Zovian cadet threw a flash grenade, temporarily blinding the creature. The Kalyan cadet, using the moment of confusion, darted forward and slashed at the creature's hind legs, forcing it to recoil. The creature roared in pain, its fury intensifying, but it was disoriented. James could see the hesitation in its movements, its instinct to strike now replaced by the need to regroup. "Now," James yelled. The cubs pounced in unison, their combined weight knocking the creature off balance once again. They were working as a pack, not in chaos, but in coordinated precision. James saw the opportunity. "Flank it now, push it toward the exit." The cadets moved in a synchronized wave, their weapons raised, their focus unwavering. The Kalyan and Zovian cadets, their weapons now used for non-lethal strikes, directed their efforts to force the creature toward the farthest corner of the chamber, the exit barely visible in the distance. The cubs followed the lead, darting between the cadets' legs, their growls a constant reminder of the danger that had surrounded them. The creature, now weakened and surrounded, growled one last time before it hesitated, unsure whether to fight or flee. It was trapped. James, sensing the creature's moment of vulnerability, took one last step forward. "That's enough." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his leadership, his calmness, his ability to guide not just himself, but the cadets and the cubs. The creature hesitated, its body tense and still. Then it turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows, leaving the chamber in an eerie silence. James exhaled slowly, his body still tense, but the adrenaline fatting. He had done it. They had done it. The cadets stood in stunned silence, their weapons still raised, unsure whether to lower them or not. The cubs, too, were calm now, their heads tilting in curiosity, sensing that the danger had passed. "It's over," James said softly. "We made it together." In that moment, the cadets looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and newfound respect. They had just witnessed something that defied everything they had been taught at the academy. The creature wasn't defeated by brute force or by individual glory. It had been driven away by unity, trust, and calm leadership. As the lights flickered and the room began to return to normal, the intercom crackled again. The voice of Instructor Rowe filled the chamber, her tone now softer than before. "Cadet Halstead, you have passed the final phase of the test. The Academy has seen your ability to lead. The protocol for human cadets will be revised. We'll be studying your methods closely." James smiled slightly, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He had done what they thought was impossible, and in doing so, he had shown the Academy and the galaxy that there was another way to lead. The cubs once again gathered around him, nuzzling against his legs and sitting contentedly by his side. The cadets, one by one, lowered their weapons. They didn't say anything, but their eyes spoke volumes. They had been changed by this trial. Skid appeared in the doorway, his expression a mix of pride and awe. "You did it," he said simply. James nodded, looking around at the other cadets, still uncertain but no longer divided. "We did it," he corrected, "all of us." As the chamber doors slid open and the Academy's leaders awaited them, James knew one thing for certain. The galaxy had just witnessed a new kind of peacekeeper, one that didn't rely on violence, but on understanding, trust, and the power of unity. And that was just the beginning.